Welcome to the Visible Art of Translation podcasts. This series of podcasts are part of the EU-funded INCREC project. Our focus is creativity, translation and technology in literary and audiovisual translation. Our goal with this series is to give visibility to the often invisible skills, role and voice of professional translators.
Hi, Natasha. Thank you for joining me today.
Hi, Nastia. Good to hear you.
Natasha is a translator and interpreter from Swedish and English into Russian. She is also a poet and a performer. She translates fiction, both poetry and prose, and non-fiction. Among her translations are the novels by Stig Dagerman, an influential figure in the Swedish literature of the 20th century. She is also a part of the Seminar of Literary Translators from Swedish, based in St. Petersburg. And she's also one of my first teachers in Swedish, so it's a great honor for me that you agreed to participate in our podcast.
Yeah, pleasure to be here.
Let's first talk a bit about you, your career. How did you decide to be a translator? Have you always wanted to be a translator? How did you get there?
Not that I've always wanted that, because, I get so confused when people say, what did you want to be when you were little? Because I don't remember wanting to be anything. But I've been always interested in languages, in English mostly. And then after school, I decided to pursue the language path, so to say. So I ended up at the St. Petersburg University in the Department of Scandinavian Studies with Swedish as a main language. And first, I didn't even dream of being a translator because I thought it was like something really, really huge. So I thought I would first I was teaching Swedish private lectures and then at universities. And also I worked as an interpreter because at that point there was a lot of assignments around. And if you knew Swedish, then it wasn't a problem to get in the business, so to say.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so, and what started me off as a translator was, in fact, the seminar you were talking about, which we both are a part of for the moment. So it was just that at a certain point, an editor from a big publishing house came to a seminar as a guest.
Mm-hmm.
And he just told us that if you are interested in trying to make a translation, then contact me. And it was English, and it was not my very favorite kind of literature, so to say.
Mm-hmm.
But I thought it's a nice opportunity to get at least some experience. So that's how I got started. I just wrote to him, and he was fine with my, what do you call it? Provöversättning.
Okay, some test.
Test,
Yeah.
test assignment. And so off we went. So I worked for them for 10 years probably.
So were your first literary translations from English, right?
Well, of course, I did literary translations from Swedish, but they were never published. So it was, just for probably for some journals or for my PhD research, but not a real book. It only came probably, I think, the first Swedish book came 5 years after I was doing translations from English.
Okay. So talking about all translations you did in general, which one have you enjoyed the most and why?
Well, of course, I enjoyed Stig Dagerman because it's a Swedish author, pretty well known or famous in Sweden, one of the classics, and totally unknown in Russia. And I was writing all my courseworks and all my PhD about him, and I dreamt about translating his works into Russian, but nobody was interested because, it's not a thriller, it's not a love novel, not a romance, so it's pretty serious literature, not easy read, so it's hard to sell.
Mm.
But for how long was it? I think 3 years ago, yeah, 3 years ago, I finally had the opportunity to come out with his first novel, and then came the second book, and soon I'm expecting the third one.
Oh, it's great news.
Yeah. Thanks. It will be out in October. So, yeah, really soon.
Okay. And what were the main difficulties that you faced when you worked with translating Stig Dagerman?
Uh, well, the difficulties are different when we are talking about his different novels, because the first one, it is very complicated language, it is very complicated syntax, and in Swedish, just as well as in English, you don't usually see texts with very long sentences nowadays. And there you have like sentences that are 1 or 1.5 pages long. And sometimes it gets like a kind of Ulysses style.
Mm.
So it is, yeah, it is pretty difficult to both not simplify the text, but also to make it clear and accessible for the reader. So that's a very fine line. I think this is probably the main difficulty, not to change the soul, so to say, of the book, but on the other hand, sometimes you just need to adapt in order to make it understandable for the reader, especially when you're dealing with kinds of text, like when even native speakers, they read those texts and they say, oh, I don't get it. And then you're sitting there just like, okay, how can I get my Russian readers to get it?
Yeah. And you're probably also thinking about the style, yes, the voice of the author you want to, yeah.
Yeah, of course. And he has also different voices for different characters.
Mm.
And there you need to also have a certain feeling for what this character is like in order to be able to create a speech characteristic that will be functional. And also metaphors. He uses a lot of metaphors. He's sometimes even really ironic about himself. So even in the text, he says, "Oh, there was that guy, a writer. He was very fond of metaphors. He could never call a thing the way it is really called."
Yeah.
That's so true.
So, in our podcast, we also talk about creativity and how we are creative when translating. So, I would like to ask you about how would you define creativity in translation?
Mm. Now, this was a tough one. Uh, well, I think that creativity is probably, to me, it's the ability to get behind the text, that I can sort of get behind the text and then find the right words in Russian to describe things that are there behind the text, because you don't need it with simple texts. If you're translating like a feel good novel, or not all of them of course, but lots of them, or a thriller, sometimes you can just go, so to say, word by word and be really close to the source text. But if it's somewhat more suggestive prose and, yeah, with a lot of symbols and metaphors in that, you just need to dive a bit deeper than that, because otherwise it's not going to work in another language.
Yeah, thinking about going behind the text, how would you personally do it? I'm very curious.
Mm. Well, we can take that one, Dagerman's first novel, as an example, because I think it's a good example, probably. I think that when I first read it, when I was a student, I understood probably 50% of the text.
Mm.
And then I reread it multiple times while doing my research, and then I probably understood 80% of the text. I mean to really understand it, not to understand the words, but what's the message behind the words. And I usually work really fast, so I just like type very fast, and then I read it aloud and then I correct the text and I read it aloud again. So to me, this reading aloud, it really works because then I get the sense whether I have found the more or less perfect option.
So do you mean you first make more or less rough draft of
Yeah, I
translation?
do.
Mm.
And if it's an easier text, so to say, then I can just start editing it. I don't need this reading aloud thing. But if it's
Mm.
poetry or it's very metaphorical text or a text with a very certain style characteristic, then I just need to read it aloud. So I would sit down in the park and never mind the people going by and just
Mm.
read it aloud for myself.
And also, as I know that you also translate poetry, so do you think the translation of poetry and just novels, literary texts, are these very different processes or?
Well, I think there are very different literary texts
Mm.
because to me, translating Dagerman, for example, it's very similar to translating poetry.
Mm. Okay.
And I can probably remember a couple of other books where I had that same feeling. But otherwise, I think it's different. I think it's different because I was translating a lot of, fantasy and sci-fi. And there, it's the suspense that counts. It's the characters that count. Yeah, you can just be a good style guide, so to say.
Mm.
But I don't have to read those texts aloud or reflect upon them like for a longer time, which is the case with poetry, because poetry is totally different. You need to think about how that sounds, not only what that means, but also how that sounds. And it's all about trying to create the same impression.
Mhm.
And sometimes you may even need to use a different metaphor or different words in order to create the same impression, because not all metaphors in poetry work in the same way in different languages. So we just can't do that.
Yeah, but you also mentioned some of the steps you take when you translate. Maybe you have some definition. How would you define the creative process you go through?
I think it's two different processes, whether we're talking about a regular book, if there are any regular books, and a special book. So which one do you want me to talk about?
Do you mean by special book a book which is like more challenging?
Yeah, more challenging, more important to me as a translator, because some assignments I can't say that I care that much about how that book is going to be accepted, because the publishing house, they make a series of 10 different sci-fi authors, and each author like 5 novels, and they are more or less the same.
Yeah.
So you don't need to be really creative, I think, to translate that if you are good at both languages and you are good at sci-fi, which I read a lot when I was a teenager and even later on. Then you don't have to, I don't think you need to do anything really special.
So was it more of a routine task for you
Yeah,
then?
yeah. But it's certainly worth doing because it improves your language, it gives you the experience. It allows you to get rid of your own mistakes, like personal mistakes, which we all have,
Hmm.
like favorite mistakes.
Yeah. But if we talk about special books and your creative process, what do you think about it?
I think that first this book needs to be read and then it needs to rest a little bit,
Hmm.
in my experience. So to have some distance from it, from the text, I really need this time
Hmm.
to sort of digest it thoroughly. And then I start by I mainly I'm going chapter by chapter, or if there are chapters, and I do a rough draft, and then I'm starting this reading aloud, and writing comments for myself. I find this extremely useful, by the way. Like if I have some doubts or I feel that I haven't found a perfect solution yet, I just make a comment in my Word document there where I write everything that comes to mind, all the options that come up, and all of my reflections, why this option is better or that option is worse, and
Mm,
and then I leave this chapter for some time and I go to the next one, and then I come back to the first one.
mm,
Because when I go through the text one more time, I sometimes get the options I never thought of. And for me, it's really about giving myself enough time and space, because this is not a routine work. So it can't be really done. It can't be done from, 9 to 5 p.m. because there are a lot of things that gets, what do you call it? Like that gets like swept under the carpet. Like after a certain time period, you stop seeing certain things in your own text.
mm.
And if you give yourself some time and then come back to it later, like have some beginner's mind and a fresh look over that, I think that this is really important.
It's actually interesting to hear about time and space, especially because sometimes we're in this situation where we have to rush and translate. But yeah, it doesn't give us opportunity to look back and
In my experience, the publishing houses, they are pretty, they have an understanding for that, and they know themselves. If it's a routine book, then you have your 3, 4 months, 6 at best. And then, of course, there is no time, space. It's a work that needs to be done. Of course, as good as possible, but I think it depends a lot on how you negotiate with the publishing house,
Hmm.
because I know that for certain books, I need more time. I can do them quicker, of course I can, but then it will just lengthen the editing process. And they note that if I will have like a couple of extra months on my side, then their editor won't have to do that much work, ask me questions. We don't need to have all those mailings back and forth.
Okay, thank you. I also wanted to talk a bit about the role of technology in the process of translation. So, which tools do you usually use when you translate? Is there any specific tool which you find very useful?
Do you promise me not to tell anyone?
No, I promise.
I don't use any.
No.
I don't use any. Or I used a lot of cat tools, when I worked for H&M, for example, because there is a lot of information, there is a lot of routine things that are repeating itself. Then you need to use some mem source or some other cat tool. You can't do without it.
Do you mean translation memory tools or?
Yeah,
Mm-hmm.
yeah, that kind of stuff.
Okay.
Otherwise, I just use and in my think the books that I work with now, translation tools can't really help me with that. I don't even see how they can be applicable, because lots of things they are, it's a language people don't use. It's the author's language. So, for example, there are a lot of expressions that can only be found in this book, nowhere else.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't really, the only thing I can do is, for example, write to some probably native speakers and other researchers, not just some native speakers, but researchers on this very author, to get their opinion, what that might mean, how they would put it in different language, or probably take a look in other translations to other languages. That might be of help.
Mm.
And it has been, in my case, a lot of time that if I have a Swedish source text and it's already translated to English or German or Italian, so I can take a sneak peek there and see what that translator preferred as an option. And sometimes you see totally different solutions in different languages. That is quite interesting.
So, have you ever consulted maybe other translators who translated to other languages?
I consulted the translations themselves, so to
Let
say.
us okay.
Yes, because my editor, she has access to translation in other languages, so I can compare, and sometimes it is very useful. Sometimes I see things like that I wonder about that, for example, in some translation to another language, they are totally missing out. And I can understand that because it's difficult to translate that. And sometimes if you can't come up with a very good option for a metaphor, you might as well skip it. It's better than to use a bad metaphor.
Yeah. So even if you don't use this kind of technology yourself in your translations, what is your opinion on machine translation in general? What do you think about it?
Um, I think it is very good if you're translating like routine stuff. It is invaluable, it saves time, and it also steals our work from us in a way.
Oh.
But on the other hand, I'm not interested in that kind of work anymore.
Mm.
So I don't mind. But I know that people who were doing a lot of, law translation, technical translation, they use those tools. They have to, because otherwise it is hard to sell yourself as a translator, so to say, if you can't use those tools. But I haven't seen any good options of machine translations in literary translation.
So you don't think machine translation can help with some creativity in literary translation? Or maybe, yeah.
Well, it depends on the text, I think,
Mm.
because if it's a, what was she called, that lady that wrote like 1,000 romantic novels, Barbara Cartland.
Mm.
I think a machine might as well write it instead of her, to not only translate, but and we know that they are really able to do so. It's the same with movies. You can deep fake a lot of things, but you can't deep fake David Lynch.
Mm.
Like not yet, at least. I don't know where it gets us.
So if we imagine that machine translation replaces professional translators, what would a world without translators look like?
I think pretty boring
Mm.
in the first place. But I think that it depends on what kind of translation you're mainly focusing on. If it's a translation that implies that you need to be creative, then I think we're off the hook for the moment.
Okay.
I don't worry about that. But if it's, standard texts, like, I don't know, CVs or I don't know, those, I don't like to use the term low quality literature, but we all know that there is low quality literature. And we know that people are not even writing it themselves any longer because there are a lot of stories about how a certain person like came up with 10 novels in a year. Like, come on. Of course, she was using technologies to do that. So, to translate this kind of literature that was sort of written by machines, you might as well use machine translation. I think they will do great.
So we now have both written texts written by machines and translated by machines, like no human involved, almost.
Yeah, of course, it's standalone cases. It's not a trend yet.
Mm.
But it's like those websites. How to write a perfect thriller, how to write a perfect blah, blah, blah. And when you have this creative process dissected like that stepwise, then no problem. The translation will also do the same, I think, in
Mm.
the machine world. Why not? But if you want, I don't think the machine will be ever able to translate big literature. Like imagine a machine translating Proust. Oh, I would like to read that.
Yeah, there is some research currently on machine translation tools specifically made for literary texts, but they have hard time translating literary texts. So,
And I hope they will still have a hard time, otherwise we will have no job.
um, yeah, which is also a concern. Yeah. Yeah, okay, I thank you. I think, yeah, it was very interesting to hear how you go with your translations and what you think about machine translation.
Thank you so much, Nastya, for giving the opportunity.
Thank you again to our invited speaker and to our listeners. Thank you for being there and feel free to share our podcasts with your family, friends, and colleagues. This is part of a series of podcasts of the EU-funded INCREC project. So follow us for more episodes and please share your comments on this platform. See you next time.